Thank you all for coming out to this one. Real quickly, starting on your left here, we have Eric Ebenstein. He's with DGI, based up in Washington, D.C., and deals with some of their policy initiatives. In the center, we have Mickey Osterreicher. Mickey is General Counsel for the National Press Photographers Association, which, for those of you who don't know, is actually headquartered right here at Grady College. And all the way down the end is Greg Agvent from CNN Air, which is their aerial imaging and reconnaissance.
No, reporting.
Reporting. I got it.
Reconnaissance is a little creepy.
It's not that far off, so we'll go with that one there. Mickey is going to start with a couple of slides about sort of the history of where this stuff started and how we got here, and then we'll have a discussion about certification and what that means.
Thanks. So as Mark said, I am the General Counsel of the National Press Photographers. Before that, I was a photojournalist in both print and broadcast for about 40 years. I spend a lot of time training journalists and police about First Amendment rights to photograph and record on the ground. A few years ago, got asked a question about drones and think it's really the next natural progression for news gathering. We've been very much involved in both the safety and the privacy issue for many years. Just to introduce our executive director, Keely Ramses, who's in the front here from NPPA. And with that, we'll kind of see if I can. So man has always wanted to fly. It's a sketch from Leonardo da Vinci, a great quote. And it didn't take too long before somebody said, in Paris, you know, we got a lot of hot air in Paris in the 1700s. A lot of things going on. And so they got some lighter than air, hot air balloons, and started going up. And at the very same time as that, somebody else thought, well, there's this thing, we think we can get images of things if we make little pinholes. And this is the first still existing photograph that was taken in Paris around the same time that they were developing hot air balloons. And of course, it didn't take too long before somebody said, well, if we got a balloon and we got a camera, I could put a camera up in one of these balloons and take a picture. And the first picture, aerial picture that was taken was of Paris, but it doesn't exist. But that's the first aerial of Boston from the 1800s. And I'm just trying to keep track of what I'm doing here. So since then, everybody's tried every way known to get a camera up in the air, whether it's a pigeon or a kite or whatever they got going. And around the same time, they had these cameras. Excuse me, in the 1800s, George Eastman came out with his camera. And it was the first time that somebody could take a camera out in the street, not be like Matthew Brady traveling around with large cameras, or sitting in a studio with your neck in a brace for 5 minutes waiting to get an exposure. And we still had some issues. People were then claiming, oh my God, the right to privacy as we know it is over. And this went on and on. They banned cameras from beaches, even though people wore more to the beach then than they wear to church now. And there came a point that Louis Brandeis, who was a Harvard Law student, and Samuel Warren wrote a treatise called The Right to Privacy. And if you just Google right to privacy, you can read it. If you read it today, you'd think they're talking about drones, because they talk about the nosy neighbors and the snooping press. They were talking about the Brownie camera. At any rate, these are some of the things that were written about that. More aerial photography. You know, remote pilots, RC pilots, they've been flying for over 60 years. It's just basically until somebody came up with a very stable platform and an HD camera that can get high definition that has basically changed the nature of things. So that's kind of where we are today. NPPA, along with the Poynter Institute, DJI, the Nebraska Drone Journalism Lab, and Google News Labs, has done training around the country. We did 4 sessions. The first right here at UGA, the second at Syracuse, the third at Madison, and the fourth in Portland. And we had about 400 people attend overall. We just passed our 100th Part 107 pilot from that group, from that training. In September, I held a drone journalism leadership summit in New York, and pretty much every newsroom from Hearst and USA, Today, AP, Gannett, Tegna were there, and we were talking about what the next step is, but we won't get into that because there's some other folks here that want to talk. I just actually came from New Orleans, where I spoke to the Law Enforcement Pilots Association about the need to cooperate between news organizations and law enforcement. Because if you do a violation, if you're flying a drone, the first person you're going to meet is not from the FAA. The first person is going to usually be a police officer who somebody down the street said, there's a drone flying over my house, can you look into it? And they're not going to know much except that they have to act like they're in charge. So we've got a long way to go. I think we all think we're very sophisticated. We've got iPhones and iPads, and we can get any information that we can at the touch of a button. But in this emerging technology, in terms of the legal issues and the things that we have going on, we're all pioneers, just like the Wright brothers. Things are being developed every day. Laws are being changed and written, and policies. Literally, I redid my deck yesterday because like 3 breaking news stories happened. Greg's going to talk about one of them. So just be good ambassadors. We all want to be good stakeholders in this. We all don't want to make the headlines for making a bad mistake. And Greg, there's your slide, so take it away with your flights over people.
Well, I'll talk a little bit about flights over people. I'm sure some of what we've been through, it's taken 2 years, so I hope you all have a lot of time. You know, I hope at some point that you guys will have a lot of questions, because I think across the spectrum of this rostrum up here is you've got a lot of experience, certainly, and from different viewpoints. Just a couple of days ago, we were informed by the FAA that we were granted a waiver for a very specific craft called the Vantage Robotics SNAP for operations over people. I just noticed that one of my pilots sitting in the room, John Rubenstahl, he'll be flying the SNAP. He's been flying a bunch of other craft as well on behalf of CNN. It's a step. It's a step of many steps behind us, many steps more to come. And the critical thing to us with the flights over people and operations over people was it started really 2 years ago. And even before that, the quick synopsis is we went into, at a time when the FAA was being pilloried, we went to the FAA and said, look, we don't want to cast stones. We're not the throw stones. We want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So what can we do to help? We've always been, CNN has always been a leader in the technological advancements for journalism, and we thought drones was a perfect opportunity for that. Yes, sir. Oh, this is actually was our very first shoot in Selma, Alabama. It was actually could not have gone better. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But it became very apparent very early that they were going to be that the drones were going to have advantages to news gathering. And if you come to the show and share this evening, we'll be showing and sharing some of the highlights of John's work and the other pilots that have been working with for CNN over the last couple of years. But we went into the research agreement with the FAA really intended to figure out what is necessary. And you know, part of it is this idea of certification. Well, certification to me is a 4-letter word. It means so much and so many different things to different people. So we had to go in and try to work with the FAA. And Emily Agvent, one of our chief legal counsel, was responsible for coming up with a reasonableness approach, which we took to the FAA. It's reasonable that if you have a craft that is extremely lightweight, that is frangible, that has a track record of safety, and you pair that with a pilot that has training, that has a maintenance regimen, that has a safety management system at their deck, and that does risk assessments before every flight, it's reasonable to think that operation would be safe. And so that's the way we approached it. It's a systemic approach. It's not all on the craft. One of the key things to us was propellers, right? Anybody in here seen the video of? Yeah, okay. Anybody in here seen the video of Enrique Iglesias? Yeah, don't Google it over lunch, but it shows what a propeller can do. So to us, enclosing the props was one of the first things that we could do. At the end of the day, CNN is about trust, and CNN is about covering the news, not being the news, and that became a critical part of it. Eric's going to talk about his Mavic that he's got sitting down there. One of the things that we are so impressed with DJI about is they put prop cages on that Mavic that allow us to use that Mavic across the spectrum of our operations. What you're seeing up there is photokite. I think technically right now there are 7 waivers for operations over people. CNN owns 3 of them. And the other ones are really pretty much for research and other applications, none really being used aggressively for the creation of content, except for us. The first one that we ever got was this craft up here. It's called the photokite. It's a tethered unit. We learned a lot. We learned so much from our efforts with the FAA. We spent 2 years, we spent about a year seeking this for the photokite. When the waiver came back, and you could see it, it's public record, you could see our waiver for the photokite, and it limits us to 21 feet of altitude. Now, I usually do this in a graphic, but let's say the average human being is 6 foot, and CNN's operations manual mandates at least 10 feet in operations over people. Now you're at 16 feet, and we could fly a maximum of 21 feet. That gave us a functional operating envelope for that drone of 5 feet. We have not used it. Right? But we didn't take that as a defeat. We took that as a challenge and kept working with the FAA to get to the next level. That's what led to the announcement just earlier this week that we do have operations over people with a specific craft. And I will say this, there's one thing that CNN does that I think is really important. I call it the 3 L's. We are low altitude, lightweight, and line of sight. It's the lowest hurdle for operations, for drone operations. We're focused on those. That's what our operations are today. The 3 L's, low altitude, lightweight, line of sight. Some of the BVL, beyond visual line of sight stuff is really, really fascinating. We're interested in that too. But for the most part right now and for the upcoming future, it's going to be that the 3 L's. Do you want to go somewhere else? Or I think I've spoken enough for now. I hope we have opportunity for questions.
So, AUVSI, which is the world's largest organization representing unmanned vehicles of any kind, submersibles on land and in the air. Mark Aitken decided that, kind of saw what was on the horizon. I'm sure most of you are aware that while FAA has struggled, and they're doing a great job now, but basically they were mandated by Congress to have Part 107 done pretty much a year and a half before they actually put it in place. So in the interim, lots of states and municipal organizations were enacting laws on their own, and they don't have the bandwidth to exercise their federal preemption. So Mark wrote this letter to the president, and it's signed on to by all those organizations. DJI is one of them, NPPA is one of them. And lo and behold, just yesterday, that happened. And I guess you can talk about that, Eric.
All right, great. First off, let me introduce myself. I'm Eric Ebenstein, Head of North America Public Policy for DJI. Thanks to everyone who made it possible for us to be here today. For those who don't know, DJI is the world's largest civilian drone manufacturer. We make drones for commercial use, for recreational use, and as Steve was talking about earlier this morning, the low barrier to entry is kind of where we began. There was a beautiful picture of a Phantom earlier in Mickey's PowerPoint. I wouldn't be a good corporate representative if I didn't bring cool stuff to look at. We have the Mavic here that was referenced earlier. This is the Spark, talking about prop guards to make sure you don't get nicked by a propeller. All kinds of good stuff. I'll be able to talk about that later in here and out back after the session is over for those who are interested. Yeah, we are a pretty, aggressive group in the drone space in terms of wanting government regulation. We don't hide from it. We don't run away from it. Our different members of our policy team at DJI are very involved in different FAA work groups, working to try to hash out the rules for what drone use should be. And my role in the company is kind of seeing what's happening at the federal government, working to influence where possible, and also working with people at this table and other partners to help kind of harmonize those rules and regulations across the states and the cities. Oftentimes that's difficult. Federal government works incredibly slowly, as we all know, although the FAA has done a good job of moving more quickly than most. That said, states and cities don't want to wait. They want to take care of the people who are right there with them and make sure that they're providing the ability to what they think they need to do. That gets really confusing for pilots really quickly. If you're flying in Florida and you're knowing maybe what Part 107 regs are because you've taken the test and you're certified pilot, maybe you know what your state regulations are, but if you're flying across 10 different cities' boundaries, you don't necessarily know city to city to city to city and how you stay, abreast of all that. What ends up happening is less compliance, not more. Nothing, that's nothing that we want. What we're talking about here is potentially doing some pilot programs. The devil, of course, is in the details, especially as something as complicated as this. We're going to wait to see the proposal, which we expect to come out of the White House in the next week or two, and then we'll have, a little bit more meat to be able to put on the bones of, yes, we think a pilot program is a really good idea for a specified number of cities to determine, to take a look at and study what local control over the airspace means. The FAA has, historically, and historically I mean in pretty short terms, laid claim to the airspace from the tops of the blades of the grass to the heavens. That's a pretty big bandwidth ask for an overtaxed federal agency, so they've had trouble kind of figuring out how it all works, and right now they don't have the manpower to get to every city, every state, and figure out exactly what's happening at 100 feet versus 200 feet versus 300 feet. So we're interested in being involved in the process. We want to make sure that all aspects of drone flight are represented equally in the process, be it for recreational purposes or commercial purposes, and are eager to continue working with regulators, news gathering organizations, city, state, federal representatives, and other manufacturers to get a good sense of how we deal with this ongoing issue.
I want to add to one thing too, that in our business, it's always been said that all sports and politics are local. Quite honestly, so's the concern about drones. And while I'm a little concerned about the idea that somehow there'd be, 30,000 different rules out there and a patchwork quilt of drone rules, I do think that there's a basic inefficiency for us when I have to go to Washington, D.C. to ask if I could fly in New Orleans. Now, anything that we can do to kind of to lower that bar and put the responsibility in the hands of the local folks, local authorities, is something that's critical too. You heard it spoken earlier in the keynote about remote ID. And for us, I think that's probably one of the biggest hurdles that we still have to clear, is a way to achieve remote identification. I could go outside right now, take my smartphone out of my pocket, point it at a plane in the sky, and it'll tell me what flight that is, what plane that is, what the tail number, all the details of that flight. I need something to that point that deals with drones at a lower level. John Rubenstahl in the back of the room will attest to this. The first person that always shows up at a CNN operation is law enforcement, to your point. Now, once they know that we are authorized, we have all our paperwork, and we have the permissions to be there, generally the next question is, can I try to fly it? But being able to let law enforcement clear that hurdle, that they don't have to worry that I'm up in the air to do something nefarious, is critical to the growth of this industry.
I want to do a quick poll of the audience here. How many of you do not have a Part 107 certification? How many of you are considering getting the Part 107 certification?
This is what it looks like.
Well, it takes a couple of steps to get there. So, Greg, you got 107?
I'm still working on my 107. Yeah.
Can you walk them through quickly what it's like preparing for the 107?
Sure. Well, I mean, first off, there's a couple of things, I run the CNN Air program. I don't fly it. I don't have gamer fingers. I'm kind of ham-handed, and John will attest that I can crash a drone quicker than anybody in this room, which is why I stay away from our more expensive ones. But the process is real simple. I mean, first off, know what you're getting yourself into, right? I think what was the number earlier? 60,000. I think it's actually up closer to 70,000 Part 107 licenses that have been issued by the FAA. If you're thinking you're going to make gobs of money, that may not be the right way to go about it, or right way to think about it. Now, what I'm seeing is a tremendous growth in the commercial use of drones, and at the high-end commercial use, industrial uses, that kind of stuff. But essentially, the Part 107 is just a knowledge test. If you don't have a manned background, aviation background, you need to have knowledge of the airspace. You need to be able to walk the walk and talk the talk, just short of actually handling a stick and rudder on a plane. Now, my pilots have their private pilot's licenses. They can fly a fixed-wing plane just as well as they can fly a drone. And we did that for a reason, but that's a different story. There's a lot of people out there working on training. There's some folks out there that'll charge you, they see green, right? I mean, let's be honest. If you're the kind of person who can learn on your own, find an online vendor, pay $50 to get an online course and dive into it. I think you heard the specifics of earning your certification at the end of Steve's conversation earlier, at the end of the keynote. But I think you have to ask yourself, why? What are you doing this for? Why are you here today? Of the people who don't have it, why are you here today? Are you here to do real estate and weddings? Are you here because you're aligned with an insurance agency? There's tremendous uses and tremendous growth, but know what you're getting in before you get into it.
So, Mark, you want me to just give a little more specific?
Please.
Actually, the question that I have for you, Mickey, is since you were deeply involved in certification process, why is certification for that commercial usage important for both the FAA, for the general public, as well as for the pilots?
The same reason if you want to drive a car, you need a driver's license. It's that simple. The rules are you have to have a Part 107, and your drone, if you're using it for commercial use, has to be registered. And you have to produce those certifications if you're asked by law enforcement. And if you're not, you can get fined. It's just the same thing. License and registration, sir, ma'am. If you got it, great. If you don't, you got a problem to begin with. So, you know, taking the test, passing the test, getting certified, it's pretty, you know, if you study, just like anything else, you'll do fine. As I said, the drone journalism workshops we did, pretty much everybody that's taken the test and studied for the test has passed the test. I took the test. You basically go online, you find the local location, you call them up, you schedule an appointment. It's $150 to take the test. Once you do it, they're all multiple choice questions. When you're done, it scores it. You don't have to wait. It tells you whether you passed. It prints out a certificate, tells you what you scored, and then you go back online and you mail it in, or, excuse me, fill in the form, and you get a temporary, just like you'd get a temporary driver's license, you can print out and have, and then this comes in the mail. And then you go online with your drone, which has, just like anything else, a model number, a series, you know, number, and you just register it, and you do that online. It's $5. You print out the certificate, and you've got both things. If you don't pass the test, you can take the test 14 days later, if you want to keep spending $150 every 14 days. But hopefully, you'll study once. The pass rate is 70. That's all you need to do is pass, is to get a 70. So on some questions, the answers are obvious. On some questions, you're going to have to learn how to read a chart. You're going to have to learn to read a METAR report, which is a weather report that anybody that flies an aircraft reads. It's really interesting. I've loved to fly since I was a little kid, but my eyesight was too bad. My son is a major in the Air Force. He's an F-35 instructor pilot. So it gives you a definitely different perspective on aviation. Just to, for example, everybody's seen runway numbers, right? We've all flown, right? We see a 5 and a 23 and a 16. I always thought, like, who invented these numbers? Why do they call them that? Does anybody know why the numbers are there on the runway? You add a 0. They're compass headings. They basically tell the pilots which way they're flying. So if you're landing on runway 9, you're really landing on runway compass heading 90. You're heading east. You'll never look at aviation the same way again once you take your Part 107, even though you're just flying one of these.
Eric, let me toss a question to you here, since you represent one of the largest manufacturers, or the largest manufacturer of these. That balance between the hobbyist and the commercial pilot, how does DGI think about that when it comes to the certification process? Is it something that you're in favor of? Are you concerned about this?
Sure, no, we think one begets the other. I mean, today's recreational pilot is tomorrow's commercial pilot. Most of these commercial applications came out of somebody, messing around with a drone and figuring out, oh, I could do this. We have a software developers kit that lets any person get into our Go app and put together a solution that's specific to their needs. So we were in favor of the civilian registration requirement that was part of Part 107. There was a court case where that was overturned. We're working with FAA during its reauthorization process and Congress to see what a sensible kind of reauthorization of that process is. In every one of our packages, before you can get to do the fun stuff, you'll see there's a couple of things overlaid over the DJI package. One is a little handout that says knowbeforeyouFly.gov. It sends you to the FAA website. It tells you all the different things you need to do. That's something that we're proud of and work with the FAA closely on to make sure that the pilots know what their kind of responsibilities are, be it commercial, be it recreational, or be it a mix of both, as it often is. So we don't play favorites. We're incredibly dedicated to both sets of our customers. The recreational consumer often gets a bad rap. Anecdotal evidence, sure, but if you look at things, a lot of times we see that, it's the, historically, as evidence shows in other industries, it's the person who has, commercial exposure or possibility to make money that is often the one more pressed to kind of cut corners or take a risk or do something because they don't want to lose their job, they want to make more money. Whereas the recreational user gets a bad rap, oftentimes it's someone who's still figuring things out, still doesn't understand the power of the craft they have. So we have a lot of safety and security technology baked into our devices, object avoidance, geofencing, return to home. You've heard remote ID now mentioned a couple of times, both in this panel in the beginning. Quick show of hands, who knows what remote ID is? Yeah, not that many of you. So if we could just talk about remote ID for a second. So there was an arc about remote identification, and as you heard this morning, it was the security agencies, the three-letter agencies that kind of torpedoed the original Flight Over People NPRM, which everybody in the industry wants to be able to fly over people and understand how and when we do it. But the agencies rightly said, well, how do we know who's flying this drone? Is this, a good guy, a bad guy, a no guy? How do we figure this out? So remote ID is kind of the answer, we think and hope, to identifying who the pilot in command is. And there are a number of different ways to do it, and all of them have advantages and disadvantages and competitive advantages and disadvantages. DJI recently made some news with its Aeroscope product. There are a number of ways to do it. We think this is a good way to do it using existing radio frequency on the craft, such that if you use the device that we have created, the police department is able to look at and see a readout, similar as a radar person in a control tower at an airport, and see, here are the 15 drones flying in this airspace, and who are they? So this is something that would be necessarily limited to the proper authorities to see who's flying which drones. I can look on the screen and say, oh, that's my utility company, they're checking power lines, that's the police department, they're doing whatever, that's the roofer, he or she is doing whatever. So when your first question, as Mickey said, is a cop saying, who is this drone, what's this drone? The cop can now say, I know who this drone is, I know who owns this one, not an issue, has authorization to do so. Or maybe this one doesn't make a lot of sense how they're flying and we need to check this out a little bit. It takes a lot of brings a lot more local control, which is something we've all talked about a lot, and is a very simple way of getting to a solution to a very important problem.
So one of the challenges, though, along those lines is Do we do that locally, or do we do that nationally? Do people have access to that information? Is it proprietary, or is there going to be some kind of database? And the problem there is, let's just say your power company's flying here, and that's great. You know your power company's flying here. But what about if somebody's actually in California and you're in New York and you're a company and you're thinking of building a wind farm out on Lake Erie, and you're surveilling with your drone the property, and somebody else who's also in competition with you says, oh, look at that. That company is now using their drone and they're flying up and down the shoreline. I wonder what they're doing. How far do these databases go? Are they local? Are they national? I mean, there are absolutely going to be more questions than there are answers. But as we develop more questions, and we try and find solutions. Mark, I don't know if you want me to get more into legal stuff. You just kind of tell us what you think people want to hear about.
I want to come back to the legal stuff in a minute. I want to ask a very quick question of all three of you, because we have a manufacturer association and a corporate representative here. Is the 107 certification process right? And what I mean by that is it rigid enough? Is it thorough enough? Is it too hard? Not enough? Greg, you want to?
Sure. Well, I'll put it this way. We demand more of our pilots. So our training regimen starts with Part 107 and builds from there. And you can read into that what you want. But you know, look, everything that we do, we try to measure ourselves against our own gold standard, right? We want to be safe in the operation. We want to have pilots with the greatest training, with the best training, with the best equipment, with the best data to make decisions. I mean, a lot of aviation is based on decision making, it's judgment, based on good intel. You have bad intel, you're going to make bad decisions. So all those kind of elements put together. Part 107 is a foundational certification for us, and we take it from there. You can't fly for CNN with just a Part 107. Let's put it that way.
It's the bare minimum. Just because you pass your road test doesn't mean you're a good driver, because we've all experienced people with driver's licenses who probably shouldn't have them. It's the same thing here. It meets the legal regulatory requirements. I mean, what you get on the test doesn't really matter. It's how you're going to fly afterwards. Are you going to fly safely? Are you going to obey the rules? Are you going to abide by all the things you learn? And part of 107 is recognizing human characteristics. It's a whole section on that. Whether, hey, I'm going to fly, I can do it, I'm cool. I mean, they talk about that, and they talk about for manned aircraft as well, when people take risks that they shouldn't take. The whole idea of drones is really risk mitigation and balancing that. And one of the things that I've been trying to stress to newsrooms is that you've invested money in your pilots. They're usually at the bottom of the food chain. They're the photographers. And having been a photographer for so long, I know what it's like to be told, yeah, just go spray it down. Yeah, just get the picture. And they need to know, newsroom leaders need to know, that just like if they had a helicopter pilot who's flying a Bell Jet Ranger for them who tells them, I can't fly today, whether it's the weather or whatever, they wouldn't say, yeah, just get in the aircraft and go fly. They would respect his opinion. They need to respect the remote pilot in command, because ultimately it's his or her license that it's at stake. And the fact that they invested the money in this, it can't be just go spray it down. If you can articulate the reasons why you can't fly, then that should be the end of the discussion.
I mean, the one-word answer is yes. We thought it was pretty good. I used to work for the federal government, and when we would introduce a rule, if we got sued by everybody, we knew we were doing a pretty good job, and if we got sued by nobody, we thought we were doing a pretty good job. If any one side was too happy, we realized we went too far in one direction. FAA, to their credit, brought people to the table, had people come together, and for the most part, when it came out, you saw adoption. I mean, the power of drones, as we heard earlier, and you'll hear over and over, is the data. It's all the data. Data is the new oil. You hear all these different things. The data on behalf of the registration was pretty good. You saw it on the big screen earlier. In under a year, you had something like 1 million people registering. That's a pretty good adoption rate, given the relative number of drones that were out there. So we were pretty happy with what we saw We worked closely with the FAA beforehand, during, we're continuing to. We think it'll be back in its, previous state before too long. And it's, again, I agree with these guys, it's a floor, not a ceiling, but to get people interested into the hobby or the profession and getting involved with it, frankly, you want it as a floor. You want to be able to have a relatively low barrier to entry, follow the rules, be smart about it, do what the FAA tells you to do, and then get better. We have as part of our, again, before you can get to the fun stuff, you have the card from the FAA saying, here are the rules. We also have a drone demo as part of our software that you can, before you actually fly it, practice it on your tablet or your phone. So there are a number of ways to get better and practice and do all the things, but that first step is the registration, and we think the FAA had it right.
But I think it's going to get harder. It was actually, I studied, it was pretty easy. If I could get a 97, you guys can do just fine. But that's not the point. The point is, the problem is a lot of the questions from 107, there's only so many questions they can ask. They've been around for a while. It's like when I was studying, it's like I've seen the question over and over again. And then I saw the questions from the practice exams on the test. It's like, so I already knew the answer. So they're going to change. They're going to put in new questions. They have to. And I think they're going to get harder. So the sooner you do it, the better off you are.
I'd like to see, because when we're talking about this, I mean, the realization is, right now, we're talking about unmanned aircraft that can go from less than half a pound, right, a toy, right, to 55 pounds. And there's a gigantic difference between the toy and that large tool. I think ultimately what I'd like to see, and this is something that we're studying kind of within our own infrastructure, within our own approvals to fly, is have some sort of ratings, right? I get my private pilot's license, I can't jump into a 737, But if I have if I've made the commitment, if I have the training, give me a little more access to the airspace. But I think there's a couple of key things to take away here. Knowing the rules and fighting that desire. I tend to put it this way. It's like giving your kid a Ferrari on his 16th birthday and telling him to drive slow. How many kids are going to listen to that? These things are incredible pieces of machinery. But to fly it safely, especially around other aircraft, right, in proximity to airports and that kind of stuff, the rules are there for a reason. And it's I think it's incumbent and important. I'm talking from CNN, right, where I said earlier, we want to cover the news, not be the news. That's one of the reasons we really are such so hard-nosed about flying by the rules and knowing the rules for that specific airspace.
Yeah, without the guards, I liken these things to flying Cuisinarts. If you're not careful, you know what can happen with that, and you really do need to be careful because somebody can get hurt.
Mickey, you said you wanted to talk a little bit about some legal stuff.
So it's a question that maybe we should answer.
I'm a 61 pilot, and to your point, I've got to get certified in every aircraft I fly.
Sure.
Can you see the time where if you want to fly power lines, you need to take a power line course, or the guy back there is in forestry, how do you fly a forest? That's what, do you see those kind of steps coming as the rules?
I don't know if you'll see that from the regulatory agencies. I do see that happening now from some of the companies that have taken up and picked up the training mantle. So you can go to a company like Dart Drones or Measure or some of the other folks that are doing training, and they've got curriculum that are very specifically designed to handle that type of stuff.
Okay. Maybe you have an answer here. Do you foresee that insurance companies for corporate owners, are they going to start wanting to see additional certifications? This specific.
We haven't even. That was part of our executive leadership. Insurance is a key component to this. If you're going to, job this out, if you're not going to have in-house, but even then, you need to look into it. There are, new insurance products out there. If somebody comes along and says, yeah, I can do this, that's the first thing you need to see is what kind of coverage they have. It's very important, and again, it's a whole new developing field for them as well. So it's pretty affordable, but it's a must. It's a key component. It's just as important as having your, I'd say it'd be your Part 107, your registration, and your declaration page for your insurance. You have to have it.
One point I want to make, or add a note of caution, I guess, is so far I've heard this compared to a car on a commercial airliner, which is hilarious for the obvious reasons. Not saying that there shouldn't be all kinds of protections, because of course there should be, and no one takes that more seriously than we do, but within relative bounds, right? We're talking about something the size of a water bottle, something the size of a soda can. The certification to get, off the ground should be relatively simple, and then of course as you're doing more and more advanced things for a company, any company is going to require you to do a little bit more before you do something professionally versus when you first start doing it. And the companies such as ours that take these things seriously want to make sure that they're as safe as possible. So you have the prop guards to guard against the propellers. For those of you who don't know, on the DJI Go app, when you want to have one of these things take off, although it looks really, really cool to do a hand takeoff, for the most part what we advise people to do is it's on the ground. You can press a button on your app and it takes off on its own and then hovers at several feet in front of you so that there's no getting into contact with the propellers. Another thing that we've seen that is, I guess, a little bit kind of a misnomer in terms of information is the relative danger of one of these striking a person. We've seen the FAA has done the Assure studying to show that these lower weight drones, we're not talking about the 55-pound ones or bigger, but some of the smaller ones, while nobody wants to get hit in the head by a drone or anything for that matter, the data has proved that it's much less serious, much more concerning than has been previously supposed. So it's consumer acceptance, it's seeing these, it's understanding these. Our devices also have kind of a battery indicator return to home function that if the drone starts getting to the point where it's going to run out of battery life before it returns back to you, it will verbally notify you, it will get a tactile response, and then it'll just take over and land the thing back where it took off from rather than have it fall out of the sky. So there's a big role for government to play, of course, in certifying the floor, and then there's a big role for manufacturers to play in making these things voluntarily as safe and easy to use and fun as use as possible so that we continue to encourage the industry so you get more CNN seeing the value in them, the press photographers seeing a value in them, using them in more and more different ways as a benefit to the industry as a whole and to kind of general society as a whole.
So much of what we're talking about here is really about education and awareness, of the rules and regulations, and speaking specifically as a potential commercial operator, right? Knowing, what the boundaries are and why the boundaries are there, is such a big part. I'm a member of the Unmanned Aircraft Safety Team, which is an FAA industry cooperative group, and that's the large part of what our remit is to try to help with the educational part of this. And make sure that people are aware of the rules and regulations. They're there for a reason.
And it's not all, serious. There's some fun and games. Return to home is a great, great function, except for the people that decided to take them on their cruise ships and launch them because they wanted to get some wonderful shots of the cruise, and then their little drone couldn't keep up with the boat. And then it returned to home, except home was about 5 miles behind them when they last left their location. So it doesn't always work.
Nope, that's a great point. Nothing always works. I'm reminded, and this dates me a little bit, the episode of The Office when Steve Carell is driving and following the GPS, and the GPS tells him to drive into the lake. And as he's driving into the lake, his co-pilot is saying, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "The GPS is never wrong." So of course, there are limits to everything. We just try to help make it a little bit easier.
But we've come a long way. The first drone conference I attended from AUVSI, in the news, they had a section, where the media could go, and they had a Wi-Fi in there. And this was in the early days when people were fighting against the use of the word drone. They liked UAS, they liked UAV. They didn't like drone because it was associated with predators and reapers and things with missiles on it and things that were used by the military. And the first time I went in there for the Wi-Fi, the password was, "Don't say drones," all one word.
We're going to take a couple questions from the audience. We don't have mics for the audience, so I'm just going to ask that one of you sort of repeat or encapsulate the question. I'll start right over here.
This pilot program is well as the bill in Congress that would move the lower altitudes to the local localities and states. There's some different opinions on that. Do you think in one way or the other that's coming?
So the question is this new pilot program in terms of this kind of joint shared custody of the airspace between the ground and 400 feet. I think all of us looked at it as, I've spent a lot of time talking to legislators around the country, and it's inevitable that something was going to happen. So rather than kind of being on the sidelines, we thought, all right, let's have a voice at the table. Let's have some input. We've done that a lot. For those of you who don't know, the FAA was mandated to safely integrate the use of UAS into the national airspace. But they only dealt with safety. Everybody was concerned with the privacy issue. So President Obama issued a mandate for the NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Agency, to deal with privacy issues. And we had a seat at the table there too. And we made sure that the best practices that came about, we had a statement, an overarching statement, that nothing in these best practices shall supersede the guarantees protected under the First Amendment. We thought that was very important. So to your question, what the sliding scale is that the local governments would take from the ground to 200 feet, and that FAA would take 200 to 400. But it's like a sliding scale. They basically just came up with it. For a government that doesn't act pretty quick, the letter went out, and literally 2 weeks later, he's signing an executive order talking about starting this program. So,
The bills in Congress too. I mean, it seems like
well, there's the only thing in Congress is a reauthorization bill. There are a number of other bills out there in terms of regulation. There's a lot of talk. One of the problems we've seen more recently is, again, flights over people. Law enforcement got involved. They want some identification, but they also actually want to be able to either seize control over or shoot down, literally, shoot down a drone they identify as a threat without, and we were sitting there going, but you need a standard. The police need probable cause or reasonable suspicion. They basically want to be able to do what they want to do with no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion, and no obligation. So let's say the New York Times is flying its drone on a news story. They deem it as a threat somehow. They misidentify it. They shoot it down. It lands on somebody's head. Don't look at us. Blame the Times. So that's a quick example, but these are the things that we have to figure out as we're going along.
Yeah, let me just add to that real quick, and then there are other questions. Given what we've seen out of this federal government, I'd hesitate to say that anything is inevitable. We've heard what's happened in the last couple of days. We haven't seen a proposal. We think we'll see a proposal in the next 2 weeks, but maybe. We'll see what it contains. I think you're referring to the Feinstein and Lewis bills amendments. Maybe it makes sense for some local control and maybe it doesn't. There's a way to do it, and that, in our opinion, that way is to get there through a kind of collaborative, thought-filled approach with all the different stakeholders sitting together, not a prescriptive, this is what we think today, so this is what we're going to mandate for all sizes, no matter what. So we've tried to work, and we have worked with both of those offices and talked about pilot programs. So we're heartened to see that there's some idea and some conversation moving towards a pilot program. What that looks like will be the $10 million question.
At the end of the day, the waiver that CNN received for operations over people was built on another pilot program called the Pathfinder. And the Pathfinder provided data. And any one of these pilot programs will give the FAA and regulatory agencies something that they need that they don't currently have, and that's some real world data. So I think they're inevitable that they're coming. I have high hopes for, I think it's being called the PPP, for this next pilot program as well.
The biggest new case that's on the books is a case called Singer v. Newton. It comes out of Massachusetts. And Mr. Singer decided to challenge the local ordinance that the town of Newton put in place, said, can't fly drones here. And he basically argued federal preemption, and this was in a lower federal court, and the federal court said, you're absolutely right. So it only applies in that court, but a lot of people are already going to take that case and use it as a template. So in the backdrop of all this other stuff going on, there are going to be people that are going to be challenging each and every local law. The problem is, as we've seen, this hodgepodge. Somebody says you can operate at 350, and that gives you 50 feet of space. Other people say 250, and you got town lines going on. We've seen Massachusetts and Florida basically try to exercise state preemption over the municipalities and say we're going to have state law because we can't have this, every time you don't even know what jurisdiction you're in and the rules change, which is exactly the reason that the FAA came into being, because without having one continuous rule, every time, you flew over Kansas, if the rule changed in Nebraska and then the rule changed, in Iowa, think about it. We wouldn't be getting anywhere. And that's exactly what we're facing here with drones, except much more on that local scale.
We've got less than 10 minutes left, and I've spotted at least 5 people that have popped their hands up, so we're going to go through these real quick. The back here first.
Mickey started to answer my question earlier, but are there organized groups that oppose the expansion of the industry for reasonable reasons or unreasonable reasons?
There are people that just like the Brownie camera, it's like, no drones. But, the Tin Lizzy was a problem when there were horses, and then the steam engine. So this is just another invention that people are going to have to get used to, because it's inevitable. But we're all pioneers in this. This is all like just sorting it out at the very beginning.
Okay. I noticed all the number of people who said they didn't have the Part 107, and I have just recently gotten mine. But if you really want to know what's going to happen on the test, go to YouTube on your computers. Or there's all kinds of people out there that will tell you what's on the test. And you can also download in many places from the FAA a manual to learn what's on the test. And all you have to do is read it. And I watched, there was an hour and a half long YouTube, and they covered like 50% of all the questions that were on it. So if you want to know what you're going to have to go through, check that out.
But we'd prefer you learn what you need to know on the test rather than just the answers.
As one of the educators in the room, my strong preference is that you learn the material, not memorize the answers. There's a big difference between those. For all the students here who have been taught to the test, let's move it. So, got a question right here.
Great. Big congrats on operations of the people. Question I have is on the SNAP and what does the FAA think as far as tethering? And you're flying, you're not tethering. Is the FAA coming out with new rules? What is a kite? What is tethered to the ground?
The FAA has been very consistent in the conversations that we've had with them. I don't know if they're talking to other folks, that whether it's tethered or not, it's an unmanned aerial vehicle and will be treated and needs to be treated as such. The reason we go to tethering is for the certain advantages that a tether may give us in certain situations. A prolonged flight where we put power up the tether. Secure flight where we may put power up and video down the tether becomes a reason for tethering. A security issue where, I mean, when you think about it, it's the ultimate geofence is the tether. But, there are plenty of pitfalls for the tether as well. I hope that answered.
And under Section 333, tethered were not considered aircraft. When they went to 107, they drew them in. That was the whole thing after the Perker case and some others where the FAA kind of got around the adverse ruling that the NTSB did in that case by saying, okay, they're all aircraft. Everything is classified as aircraft. And that was the way for them to get control. The problem is, if they're all aircraft, they deserve the protection of aircraft. And we've seen people exercise self-help, use fire hoses, shoot shotguns, shoot nets. Now, if they're all aircraft, it's a federal violation to shoot an aircraft. They don't take kindly to pointing laser beams at the pilots' cockpits when they're landing. They wouldn't take kindly if somebody decided, there's a helicopter over my house, I think I'll let loose a load of buckshot. And yet, they just kind of go, well, it's an aircraft, but we're not going to do anything about it. So it's always a double-edged sword.
I have time for one more question.
Congratulations to your waiver. What do you guys think is coming sooner versus rather than later, like end of 2018, or like the last of quicker waivers, things like flying tonight? Do you think we're close to getting a quicker response, or do you think it's still this year away?
Well, I think Lance is a major step forward. I look forward to Q1 2018 when they're expanding beyond the 50 test airports, because quite honestly, this is my perspective as a journalist, the 50 airports are in flyover country right now. North Dakota, South Dakota, Upper Peninsula, Michigan, Iowa, Minnesota. When there's breaking news there, we're there. But that's going to be a wonderful test platform. I can't wait for it to be rolled out beyond those 49, I think, is the actual number of airports. The night waiver requires some specific equipage and things like that. So I don't think that there's going to be a fast pass for night waivers, although there are plenty. I think it's the #1 waiver granted is operations at night. So there's plenty of precedent out there. And that's something where you could go onto a public website, FAA waivers granted, and see what other folks have done to get there to earn their waiver. The FAA uses that as a precedent as well, and it's not boilerplate, I don't think, just yet, but I think they can move pretty quickly on that. The problem with a lot of those waivers is you're still at the end of the line when you start.
So during Irma, we had that summit meeting in New York. Joe Mora, who's the head of the UAS program for the FAA, was there. We guaranteed that what he had to say would be off the record. He had a lot to say, and it was off the record, so I can't tell you. But what I can tell you was right then and there, the head of UAS operations for USA Today was having drones operating in Florida and Houston. He was on the phone. Now, waivers are normally 3 months at a minimum. He was getting waivers over the phone in 20 minutes. He was actually sitting there during our conference getting waivers for his news gathering crews to fly within 20 minutes. And the basic thing is this. There are grid maps. There's GPS. If you can call and ask the FAA, listen, I want to fly at this location, at this altitude, at this time. Just ask for what you want. If you ask for the world, the answer is going to be no. If you ask for what you want and what you need, they're willing to give it to you. They might say, you might ask for 150 feet, and they say, if you're willing to take 100, you can have it now. It's literally like an auction going on. And we all sat there with our mouths open because we thought, given the FAA moving at the glacial speed that it does, it'll be years, and here it was already. It was happening in real time right in front of us.
Well, they fast-tracked those in a process called ECOA, and the ECOA is one of the, I think, a standout response in those situations. The special operations people fast-tracked those that were specific to first responders, media, insurance, industries that were involved in that type of stuff. I've gone to the FAA on a couple of occasions and said, hey guys, you have a system here that worked. Why don't you roll it out wider? It worked just that way. We did the same. Puerto Rico, Texas, Florida. We would file an ECO and get a response in 5, 10, 15 minutes.
Again, there are good examples like they have. We have good examples with the California wildfires now and the flooding and all the other tragic stuff. But generally speaking, going back to my federal government days, no one in the federal government gets fired for saying no. And if the government doesn't move fast enough, what is anyone going to do about it? So I'm not that excited about how fast it's going to happen. We're going to get there. It's going to improve, but it's going to be incremental. It's going to be slow. We haven't talked about too much about the political side, which the FAA has thankfully stayed out of, but we're going to have a new FAA administrator in a not too distant future, and who knows what that's going to portend. So stay tuned. We keep, as a company, we're, again, proactive as much as possible, reaching out to the FAA, giving them all the information we can, saying, just tell us more. Tell us what the world is, and we're going to live in it.
You brought up the administration and politics. This is, again, my perspective. We've been invited to the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House on several occasions, and I marveled at how engaged and involved this administration is in the growth of this as an industry. They want to move forward.
And with that, we have reached the end of our time. So first I want to thank Greg, Vicki, and Eric for coming out and joining us today.